Curtis makes $14 an hour restocking shelves at a hardware store, and every other Friday, $61 comes out of his check before he ever sees it and lands in an account he opened 4 years ago on his lunch break, almost as an afterthought. He didn't tell anyone he opened it. There was no plan that day beyond noticing that $61 wouldn't change what he could afford for groceries that week. 4 years later, that account has grown into something Curtis hasn't told a single person about, and near the end of this video we're going to look at the actual number, because it's not what you'd guess from a $14 an hour paycheck. Most people assume building wealth requires a big salary first. That assumption is exactly what keeps people earning $14 an hour from ever starting at all. Curtis has heard the assumption plenty of times, mostly secondhand in the tone people use when they talk about investing like it belongs to someone else's life. His own mother used to say money made money, meaning you needed money first, a lot of it, before any of the advice in magazines applied to a family like theirs. Curtis grew up believing that as a fact of the world, the way you believe the weather is just going to do what it does. It took him until his late 20s to find out it wasn't true. Here's the math nobody explains at the register. $61 every 2 weeks is $1,586 a year. Invested in an ordinary index fund at an average return, that same amount, contributed every year for 30 years, becomes roughly $241,000. Not because Curtis got a big raise, not because he picked a hot stock, just because $61, repeated on a schedule, compounds the same way for a stock clerk as it does for anyone else. This is the part that gets skipped in almost every conversation about money. The compounding doesn't care what your job title is. It doesn't check your salary before it decides whether to work. A dollar invested by someone making $14 an hour grows at exactly the same rate as a dollar invested by someone making 4 times that. The only variable that actually matters is whether the dollar gets invested at all, and for how long it's left alone. Put another way, the market has never once asked Curtis for a resume before crediting his account with a return. It doesn't know he's a stock clerk. It doesn't know his hourly wage. It only knows that $61 showed up on a schedule, and it treats that $61 exactly the same way it would treat $61 from a surgeon, because money, once it's actually invested, stops carrying any trace of where it came from. Here's why almost nobody at Curtis's income level believes that, and it's not because they're bad at math. The financial advice most people hear is built for people who already have extra money lying around, people debating between a Roth and a traditional account, people asking which index fund beats another by 0.5%. None of that advice speaks to someone deciding between the store, brand cereal, and the box that costs $1 more. So people at Curtis's income level tune out the whole conversation, reasonably, because it was never built with them in mind, and they quietly assume wealth building is a game reserved for people who make real money. That assumption isn't stupidity. It's a completely rational response to advice that never once addressed their actual situation. Curtis used to change the channel whenever one of those finance shows came on, not out of resentment exactly, more the specific tiredness of watching people discuss problems that weren't his problems, in a language that assumed a version of his life he didn't have. It took his cousin talking about a percentage instead of a dollar amount, a small technical detail, for any of it to finally feel like it applied to him at all. Curtis started differently, almost by accident. His cousin mentioned at a cookout 4 years ago that his work offered an automatic retirement contribution and that the company matched a small percentage of it, and that not taking the match was, in his cousin's words, turning down free money attached to your own paycheck. Curtis went in the next Monday and signed up for the minimum required to get the match, 4%, without doing any of the math you just heard. He just didn't want to leave free money on the table. Here's the moment the plan almost died about a year in. His car needed new brakes and a battery in the same month, $340 he didn't have sitting anywhere convenient. The easiest move would have been pulling from that account, since technically he could, and for about a week he genuinely planned to. He'd already looked up how to request the withdrawal, had the login saved in a browser tab he kept open for 3 days without clicking through. Then his cousin mentioned, almost in passing, that pulling money out early meant paying a penalty on top of taxes, that the $340 would actually cost him more, like $420, once the account took its cut. Curtis put it on a credit card instead, paid it off over 3 months, and left the retirement account exactly where it was. It wasn't a heroic decision. It was mostly annoyance at the idea of paying a penalty to touch his own money, the same stubbornness that would have made him refuse to pay an extra $80 for anything else in his life. That one decision, made mostly out of stubbornness rather than any grand financial wisdom, is the reason the account still exists at all 4 years later. Discipline that survives usually isn't the dramatic kind. It's the kind that shows up disguised as being too annoyed to pay a fee. By year 2, Curtis had stopped thinking about the $61 almost entirely. It left his check the way taxes did, automatically, without a decision attached to it each time. This is the part that matters more than any specific dollar amount. The habit had become invisible to him, which meant it had also become unstoppable, in the quiet way that automatic things tend to outlast decisions you have to keep making on purpose. Here's a test that came later, in year 3, that had nothing to do with money directly. A guy Curtis works with, making almost exactly the same hourly wage, got a car loan on a used truck that ran $610 a month, and for a few weeks, Curtis felt the pull to do something similar, to have something to show for 4 years of the same job. He looked at his own account instead, at the number sitting there quietly, and realized he already had something to show. It just didn't have wheels or paint, and nobody at the store was ever going to ask to see it. You've probably felt some version of that pull yourself, the sense that 4 years of work should leave behind something you can point to, something that shows up in a driveway or a closet. It's worth sitting with the fact that the thing worth pointing to was never actually meant to be pointed at. That's most of what makes it work. Here's the number, the one from the beginning of this video, 4 years in, $9,412. Not $241,000 yet, not even close, because that number is what 30 years of this habit becomes, and Curtis is only 4 years into it. But $9,412 is more than most people at his income level, or honestly at incomes twice his, have ever managed to hold on to for more than a few months at a time. Nobody at the hardware store knows the number. Not his manager, not the co-worker with the truck, not even his cousin, who only knows Curtis took the advice, not what it grew into. That's not secrecy for its own sake. It's just that the number was never for anyone else to see. It was always for a version of Curtis decades from now that the current Curtis will probably never fully believe he's building toward, restocking shelves at $14 an hour, one quiet paycheck at a time. Some nights, closing out the register at the end of a shift, Curtis thinks about the number for exactly as long as it takes to lock the drawer, and then goes home and doesn't think about it again until the next paycheck lands, and the $61 disappears the same quiet way it always has. There's nothing dramatic about that ritual. That's precisely what makes it survive. That's really the whole lesson here. Wealth was never about the size of the number on your paycheck. It was always about whether any piece of that paycheck, however small, gets left alone long enough to grow into something the paycheck itself could never become. If this changed how you think about what your income actually allows you to build, subscribe. There's another one coming about the specific match percentage most workplaces offer that almost nobody actually claims, and what that unclaimed money is quietly costing people every single year.